Welcome to Cycling Explained, hosted by Brent from Pro Cycling Bets. Cycling Explained attempts to demystify the world of professional cycling and delves into the variables surrounding the nuanced layers of the sport itself. In each episode, we'll explore one variable and how it affects the riders, the teams, the tactics, and the betting markets. Want to begin to watch cycling but don't know where to start? Interested in betting on races but have no idea how to find good value picks? You've come to the right place. All right. Hey everyone, it's Cycling Explained with Brent and Nick today here. We're going to be talking about the race and the peloton in this episode. And Nick is kind enough to share his time and ask me questions and for us to both discover more about cycling as a sport.
Awesome. Excited to be here and learn more about cycling from you, Brent.
Sweet. Do you have any questions off the bat that you've thought about with respect to the race, or do we want to just start talking about one of the core topics here?
Yeah, one thing I wanted to kind of ask you about that I heard a lot while watching a bit of the Giro was the different jerseys. I think there's different jerseys for different riders, or different jerseys for each part of the race. So what's up with that, and what do they mean?
Yeah, jerseys are potentially one of the most interesting aspects, and also very hard to understand because each race has its own jerseys. So a lot of the French races, so right now the Criterium de Dauphine is on, and it kind of borrows the jersey colors from the Tour de France. So it will have like the Malheur Vert, or the green jersey for the rider with the most points. Or of course, you probably know the yellow jersey for the rider with the most, like the GC winner. But then again, you have the Giro, which is like has the pink jersey. And the funny thing where all these jerseys come from is it depends, right? But it seems to be newspaper based. So these newspapers all started these races in the 1930s or earlier. So the pink jersey was from this newspaper that used to print their like articles on pink paper. And since they were the main sponsor of the race, the Giro's jersey is pink, and that's why you see pink everywhere and like all that jazz. And the same thing with the yellow jersey. It used to be like yellow paper, and that's where the jerseys come from. And then each race has usually three main jerseys. It depends. Some races, I'm getting ahead of myself here, but you have the general classification jersey, which is the rider who is currently winning the race. And so they'll wear that, whoever's currently winning. And that's why you usually have a prologue, so like that short time trial at the start of major races is to kind of like set who is going to wear that jersey.
Gotcha.
For the next stages. It used to be that the previous winner from the previous year would wear the jersey going into the prologue. I think you might still be able to do that, but it's not done as often. And then with respect to the jerseys, you then have the points jersey. So points is probably in every other major stage race. It's basically you get points for winning a stage. You get points for winning intermediate sprints, which are scattered throughout the stage to make it more interesting for viewers. And then that color is green for the Tour de France, and it's I can't believe we were just watching Giro, but it's some other color for the Giro. And then you have finally another major jersey you have at most races, but not all of them, is the King of the Mountains. Because if there's no mountains, then you're not going to have a King of the Mountains jersey. But if there's no hills or whatever, so at the quite well known as the polka dot jersey, it's probably people's like favorite jersey to wear, actually, because it's kind of like a romantic kind of appeal to the person who's wearing that King of the Mountains jersey. It's a very claim to fame. It's sexier a little bit, like you toppled the mountain. And then other races will have similar ones. So I think it's blue polka dots for the Giro or the Vuelta. I think it's the Vuelta has the blue polka dots. And then it's a different color for the other one. And so you can have a rider who has all three of the jerseys, and then it will be the second place rider in that category to wear the jersey, because one rider can't wear three jerseys. It'd be kind of funny. You have some guy who's like,
overheating, wearing all that gear.
He's just like, but no, it would go to the next rider. So, for example, Pogacar would have the jersey for a while at the Tour last year, And then since he's the youngest rider, he'd also have says usually a young rider jersey as well at the major races, which is white for the Tour de France. But since he was already wearing the yellow jersey, it would go to Rider X, who is the next youngest and the next on GC, who was closest to winning. And what's interesting about the jerseys is it really defines the race in the first few days. I've been thinking a lot about this, but races are heavily backloaded for two reasons. Well, it leads to two things happening. But when you heavily backload a race, a lot of the GC contenders tend to stay very close together until the hard effort at the end. And why race organizers want this is because they know, based on statistics, that like people don't watch races once a leader gap has separated by so much. So to have the GC contenders close, you're going to retain those viewers for a longer period of time, which is why they backload events. And so in the first week of these events, so the first few days of a week-long stage race, you'll have these riders who are going to win the jersey for a day, right? Because they may be able, these sprinters, or these people who will never be able to win the general classification over the course of the 3 weeks, will attempt to win the first stage, because then they get to wear the yellow jersey, because theoretically they're the leader in the general classification, even though they'll never win the long-term 3-week battle. They get to keep that jersey for their collection, so they'll get a jersey, they'll get a hat, like in the Giro, because it's a little colder, they'll get like leg warmers, arm warmers, all pink. They'll get a helmet that's pink. Well, maybe that's done by the team. I'm actually not sure, but a lot of the gear is given to them by the race organizers.
Gotcha.
And the funny thing about the jersey is that, given in this era of modern racing where there's so much focus is on aerodynamics, it's actually like a negative to sometimes have the jersey if you're going into a time trial, because they want you to wear the provider's suit. Like the race organizer will provide you with a suit, but it's not, in this day, they like fit the rider's suit dramatically to the body, so it reduces all the drag. But then if you given, they only have like small, medium, large in the kind of race organizers, because they don't know who's going to be winning at that point in time. And so it's actually like less aerodynamic. So I think they've changed the rules a little bit, where like you don't have to wear the time trialing suit of the color, but sometimes people still do. I mean, it's minor, but everything's just like minor gains in this day and age. So I think that's a little bit interesting. But overall, I think there's just a lot of romantics about the jerseys, and it's kind of fun to do that. And riders will chase after it. I mean, I think anyone would really want to have a yellow jersey to hang up in their house for the rest of their life.
You mentioned that as kind of something they get to keep. So if they win, or if they are awarded the jersey for a stage or for a day, they get to keep it afterwards. They don't need to give it back or give it to the next guy. That's cool.
It's pretty cool, right? It's kind of, you think about it, it's kind of expensive too, I think, but for the race to have like, and planning wise, I'm just glad I don't have to plan that, because like you'd have to have, I thought about this probably way too much, but you'd have to have like, what if all 21 stages were won by a person who wore a large? You know what I mean? Or like
probably
all
stages, out a
stages,
bunch of other sizes. Yeah,
you'd have to print out a bunch of sizes, and it's like not cheap, especially for the smallest stage races. Like for Tour de France, it's relatively pocket change, but for the smallest stage races, it's like expensive. And I think it's lucky that most of the riders are probably a small. There's less diversity in cycling body type than there is in, I don't know, NFL football. So that's kind of neat.
You mentioned for the time trials, people are potentially wearing kind of custom fitted gear. Are there different gear that they're wearing at different stages, or depending on the specific environment they're in, or is a rider kind of wearing the exact same gear the whole race?
Yeah. It differs depending on the stage, and it also differs throughout the stage, because the weather can change. We're not in a stadium here, which is interesting. So I was just watching a stage actually not a stage, it was Brussels Cycling Classic. Or maybe it was the first stage of the Criterium de Dauphine. I can't remember. There was a lot of cycling happening this morning. But it started sleeting for 5 minutes. You know, you just
Oh,
go over a mountain and it just like has this like random burst of like sleet, and so it's
yeah,
just like
yeah.
sleeting. And so the riders were like unprepared and like trying. Some had like rain jackets in the back of the pocket, but others didn't. So it's tricky. What's interesting, so you'll have like there's also rules against socks too. So sock lengths can only be like X high,
Oh, well.
which is kind of hilarious. But in the colder races, what riders do is they just wear leg warmers. So like they're getting the same aero benefit, and so
Mhm.
sometimes they'll wear leg warmers even when it's like slightly not cold because like it's like not legal to wear socks that high, but it is legal to wear leg warmers that high,
Gotcha.
which is kind of a nifty rule. And then they'll do some acrobatics. Like I'm okay at riding a bike, but they are able to take off their leg warmers while riding the bike,
Wow,
and it has to
that's
go. Oh,
impressive.
so they what they do is they unclip their shoe. I think they take off their shoe. I watched one of them doing this because it's
Wow.
really tight, the leg warmers, and then they take off the thing while on the bike, and, and I'm just like, oh dear me. If I ever tried to do that, I don't know about you, Nick, but I'd be on the floor instantly. So
And I imagine they're going pretty quick while they're doing this as well. So
yeah,
low margin
yeah.
for error. Well,
There was a rider recently, said Kus, who was his battery had died, so now all the shifters are like battery done. So there's no wires, but he couldn't change gears because his battery died. So he was reaching back into the back wheel, like where the gears are on the back wheel,
yeah,
while on
yeah.
the bike and going like 70 kilometers an hour,
Jesus.
trying to like change his battery. And I'm just like,
Wow.
wow, like the announcers were like having heart attacks too. So it's bad when the pundits who are like usually like past riders who kind of migrate to being pundits and announcers, that when they're concerned, it was like, yeah, it was a little aggressive. So they'll wear that, and then they'll take off. It's hard to plan, kind of. Some riders wear gloves, some riders don't because it gives them blisters. You'll see that. It's kind of interesting to take note of who's riding
Mm,
it, who's not. Most of them will. I think one of the big differences that people, when they first, the advice I give people when they first, I don't give a lot of advice because I'm not the best cyclist, but when I do give the advice that usually you don't have enough weight on your feet. So
mm,
when you put more weight through the pedals, it takes off pressure off your butt, takes pressure off your hands. You just like generally have a much more enjoyable time riding. But most people aren't powerful enough to have all their weight or like constantly pressing through the pedals,
yeah.
and so they'll get tired hands and they'll get tired butts, and you realize as you kind of progress as a cyclist and you can put more weight to the feet that it actually takes a lot of pressure off those areas, and it's just like a much more enjoyable experience. So anyway, that was a long-winded way of saying sometimes they have gloves, sometimes they don't. Helmets they of course have now these days, which is good. They used to have these like rubber helmets,
Mm.
and they also used to only use them on the downhill. So back in the day, they would just like keep them in their back pockets, store it there, and then when they're going down the hill, they're like, "Huh, we
No
might
way.
die. Let's pop these let's pop these rubber helmets on." So yeah, not super great there, but yeah, it's impressive the gear and how far it's come. There was this 1998, 1989, 1988, 1988 Giro stage. So we were just watching the Giro organizer. He wanted to make it super epic, and so he put it on this mountain that people had never done before. There was snowbanks above their head.
Oh,
It was completely freezing, and they were just talking about the difference in gear between now and then, and they were rubbing lanolin on their bodies to stay warm
wow.
because they didn't really have anything else. They like their everything froze, and it's tricky to stay warm. But I think a few kind of new fangled things, like obviously Gore-Tex is a big one, but also the neoprene gloves
Mm,
are a
mm.
really huge breakthrough that came, so that your hands don't like completely freeze when you're in the cold and wet. But overall, it's tricky. It's still not easy. Some riders run cold, some riders run hot. I think it's just like all humans.
Yeah, and in terms of kind of like body temperature and temperature control, like what's kind of happening if a rider's getting too hot? Like what's happening? What's going wrong if the rider's getting too cold? Like how's that affecting performance? Like what happens on either extreme?
Yeah, great question. And I believe this is huge, and I think it's huge mainly because the heat aspect is the big one, which we can really dig into here. when riders get too cold, we'll start there because I think I can knock that one out quickly, and then we'll dive on to the heat aspect.
Mm.
But riders usually generate a fair amount of heat. So even if they're riding at 4 degrees, when you're in the bunch, in the peloton, you're like a little bit warmer because the body's all around you.
Yeah.
Yeah, when you're out of the bunch, you can definitely freeze, especially when you're going up a climb, the temperature drops. There was this classic stage in the 2019 Giro, I think, between Geraint Thomas and the Canadian rider at the time, Michael Woods, and they were going up together right as a final. It was a final climb. It was freezing out. It was snowing. You know, the TV cameras weren't working very well. So like, you really only see them coming out of this snowstorm, and you just see Geraint Thomas, who was, you know, I think you watched a little of the Giro. He was winning for a bit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But anyway, in this one, his hands were just frozen, and he just slipped off the bike. His left hand just slipped, and then he slips like right on the finish line, and so the Canadian wins. So staying warm is obviously very important, and in the Giro, riders were getting shipped tea, like hot tea, and you know, eventually, you know, you just try and keep warm, but it's a lot easier to keep warm than it is to reduce your body temperature. When you get too hot, especially with global warming, it's becoming more and more of an issue that riders are overheating. So it's now basically always riders will do their warm up, because you have to do a warm up to, like, you know, you do your yoga to kind of warm up the muscles and what have you. So you kind of have to do the warm up to be able to perform right from the gun, which is needed now in these races. They're no longer like training rides that you can do to warm up. They're wearing ice packs. So they'll ride on the rollers on the trainer, and they'll wear ice packs to keep their core body temperature low. And then throughout the race, the domestiques, or the rider or the leader, will go back to the car, get ice socks specifically. They'll just have like socks filled with ice that they'll put down the rider's back. And then they'll repetitively do that throughout the race, time and time again. And it's also why helmets have are really like trying to increase airflow, because just like when your head gets hot, like your brain starts to fog and all that jazz. And so helmets are actually really not only trying to be light these days, but also trying to be super, super breathable. And then finally, I think probably the most interesting aspect is nutrition. One of the best ways to get your body warm or get your body cold is through food temperature. So they'll have Jumbo-Visma was one of the teams that was using Never Second. So Never Second is a brand that offers nutrition in like 30 gram, 60 gram segments, which is, we can get into that, but it's essentially a way like riders want to take in about 120 grams of carbs per hour. They offered this product that was like a slushy. So they're trying out this slushy that like it was still easy to eat on the bike, because obviously a lot of food has to be easily edible. But then it was also like kind of frozen and like easy to take in the car and like put in the freezer. And all the teams wanted it. They're all jealous of Jumbo-Visma last year because like this product was revolutionary. Basically, like it like offered you the right amount of carbs and also got you cool. Yeah, it's a hard thing, and riders will do heat training specifically. So they'll like ride and then go into sauna, or they'll sauna and then ride, because your body does adapt over the course of a few weeks to ride better, and it produces sweat better, all that jazz. It's also tricky if you're a heavy sweater, right? You gotta they do sweat tests to make sure like, are you sweating a lot, because then you need to take in more sodium. All that kind of happens these days, and it's a really big issue, because a lot of these events are happening in areas that are super hot. Like Vuelta happens in August in Spain, and it's almost always extremely hot. And they've debated switching it to April, because it's just, I think we talked about this in the first episode, just because it's like so hot all the time.
Is there? You mentioned they're eating like cold stuff and putting ice cubes on the back. Are there any? I know in other aspects of the race, there's like restrictions put on them, like their socks can't be too tall. Are there restrictions around cooling techniques, or do you like foresee some of this stuff being made restricted?
It's a good question. I think the UCI isn't, I would say, the classiest body. Their lack on enforcement, they just don't do a good job at enforcing the rules they put out. For example, the sock rule, they almost never actually enforce, and they've been enforcing it less lately. So But I think everyone wants riders to be safe, and overheating and stress from that is definitely like no one wants to see that. So I don't think they'll ever put a ban on that. What they do currently have a ban on is, and they'll probably change, is glucose monitoring. So
Hmm.
the continuous glucose monitors that people have on their arms, they don't allow that in races. And I think most pundits and people think they will, because essentially you're currently allowing riders to track their power data, right? So riders know exactly how much power data on their head unit they're outputting, and so they can match their effort based on that power, because you get
Gotcha.
really fine tuned to how much power you're outputting. And so the why they're arguing, like, I guess the benefit of having a continuous glucose monitor is you can better time your efforts. Like if your glucose is
Mm-hmm.
low, you're probably not going to be ready to do an attack and like stay for a long period of time out there.
Mm-hmm.
But you can do the exact same thing with power to some degree. It's more helpful to have a glucose monitor, because then you can, eat a little bit, wait a little bit. But then again, riders are judging like, hey, I'm riding this power and I'm feeling like this.
Yeah, yeah.
So they're already judging it, and then they'll decide whether to go or not. And so the glucose monitor is kind of just a gauge also, where it's like, okay, my glucose monitor is reading this. Can I go or not? It's a little bit more kind of fine tuned, but I think what they're waiting for, the UCI, is really for it to become understood by teams across the board,
Mm-hmm.
used by teams across the board in training, have a wide enough field of use, and then they'll be like, okay, it's legal, right?
Mm-hmm.
What they
Gotcha.
don't want to be doing is essentially allowing it before enough teams have. They don't want one team or two teams to use it and have complete domination. So they
Totally.
want the usage to be spread across the board. So they're just kind of waiting for it to be more mainstream. But that's what they don't allow right now.
Yes,
Yeah.
that makes sense. You mentioned UCI. Is this like some global governance for cycling, or what's their, yeah, what's UCI?
Yeah, UCI. So I sometimes make the joke that any, you know, acronym that you don't know what it stands for in cycling, it's going to be a French acronym. So it's going to stand for
Okay.
something in French. Most of the things, just because like the UCI is actually from Switzerland, and so they also speak French there, and German and Dutch. I think they're just like very multilingual. But the UCI has its home base in Switzerland, and it's the governing body. It stands for the Union Cycliste Internationale. There I am butchering the French pronunciation, but it's the head governing body for all these cyclists. It will also attempt to enforce rules. So this the race organizers and the race commissaires will enforce the rules. It's a good way of this is a good way of looking at it. It's like the states, United States. So
Yeah.
every state will have its own court
Mm-hmm.
level, and then they'll raise it to the Supreme Court if they're like, they don't know what to do with it, or they
Gotcha.
just want to throw it up there. It's the same thing with the UCI. The race organizers and the race commissaires are like the states who are enforcing the rules during their race. And then if there's a complaint against the race organizers, or for some reason, the head body wants to enforce it, then it goes to the UCI, and the UCI will enforce it. In terms of like infringements, it can happen from both the race organizers and also the UCI. The UCI typically handles doping complaints or
Okay. Yeah.
water complaints, and we'll try to enforce that, because that's kind of not by the race organizer per se. So because it spans across all the races that the rider would have been doing, and the UCI also recently, they in 2011 they instituted that agents for riders have to be registered, and so you'll take a test. It costs 600 francs, and you can then represent a rider. There's still a lot of gray area where like you can like be one team's press officer while you're being an agent for a rider
Mm-hmm.
and getting them hired by another team. Like there's still like a lot of eh, not super great stuff that happens in the rider agent industry, but it's a lot better than it was. So that's good.
And when you say agent, we're talking about somebody kind of managing them as if they were like an actor would have like an agent helping them deal with the contracts
Yeah,
and with their career.
yeah, exactly. And
Hmm.
so you're legally. These riders are either self-employed contractors or employees of the team. Most opt to be self-employed contractors. They lose out on the benefit in like the holidays. So I guess maybe if you were in like a super left-leaning, if the team was registered in a super left-leaning country, you may want to be an employee more so because you get more benefits.
Yeah.
But then again, most are self-employed contractors. And just like in the NFL, the NBA, you have player agents who will negotiate. You can also have agents now that will negotiate for these riders. It's
Cool.
also the case that you can legally have your family members be your agents without taking the test, which has led to some like really bad stuff. Specifically, everyone kind of jokes about Remco Evenepoel, who's one of the big six, one of the big six fast riders, who are really going well at this point in time. He's also Belgium, so he faces the most press criticism because they love their cycling. And anyway, his dad, I think, signed Remco to over dinner one night to Patrick Lefevre, who's this kind of character in the cycling scene, who owns Alpecin de Koenig. Maybe not owns, but yeah, I think he does own it. And then he basically got Remco Evenepoel at a super low ball, like it's at
Oh,
1.5 million, which is high a year. But for someone of Remco's caliber, let's take Tadej Pogacar is probably getting paid 10 million a year. So the same caliber rider, but getting 5x, like he's literally losing
wow.
5 times the amount of money. So
Yeah, yeah.
it's yeah, so I think the agent industry and none of these numbers are public either. So that's the really poor thing about the
Oh,
industry is like,
interesting.
yeah, like the NHL.
Hmm.
Like if I go look up an NHL, I can see what they're getting paid.
Yeah, totally.
It is public knowledge. Whereas with riders' contracts, none of this is public. It's all the media guessing or the media getting information from some insider or
Hmm.
source and like seeing
Yeah,
the
yeah.
numbers, but it's never public.
That's super interesting. I want to circle back to something you mentioned before. You used the term race commissaire. Are these like people at the specific races making sure they run smoothly, hired by the tour, or what's the rule?
Yeah, so the race commissaires, I actually don't know who they're hired by. To be fair, that's a really good question. I believe I thought they were just done by the race organizers who would have race commissaires, but maybe they're actually from the UCI and they go to each race. I'm sure there's got to be an accreditation there somewhere. So yeah, I'll look into that. But the race commissaires, you'll have about 3 to 4 per race. What they do is, well, you actually might have more, but they're on the finish line and they're in the cars during the race. So you have one on the finish line who can judge the photo finish because theoretically, if two people tie, you're supposed to have, even though this happened early in the year, you're supposed to have like a 1 kilometer sprint from the finish line. Like you just take these riders out of the race and like plop them down and then like go race and then
Oh
see who wins again. But
wow.
um, they can judge yes or no whether or not uh, the rider wins, I guess, in the photo finish. But then they're also in the car making sure that all the rules are followed by, because there's a lot of organization that goes into these races, right? You have a bunch of riders who then have 2 to 3 team cars behind them supporting them.
Hmm.
And then you have like breaks that happen and you're allowed to send, once a break is larger than a minute from the main peloton, you're allowed to send, or it's 30 seconds, minute 30 seconds, one of the two, you're allowed to send team cars through for the riders who are in the break. So for example,
Gotcha.
if Ineos has a rider in the break, they're allowed to send one of their team cars past the peloton behind the break so that they can support their rider faster if he gets a flat or a puncture,
Hmm.
or, chain drops, what have you, or her. And the race commissaire will also like enforce, like, yeah, basically yell at people if someone's giving someone a sticky bottle, which means like, someone goes back to get their bottle and they get pulled by the car,
Ah,
which is quite
yeah.
common. And then they'll also sometimes do barrages, which is a barrage is when, let's say, a rider crashes out and then, or crashes or gets a mechanical for some reason. Sometimes the race commissaire will deem it legal to allow the rider to catch back up to the break with aid. So they'll
Oh
allow the
wow.
rider to ride
Oh.
behind the car. Yeah, if it wasn't their fault, for example, the crash,
Gotcha.
then they'll allow the rider to draft behind the team car back to the peloton. But then sometimes they're like, no, it was the rider's fault, or like, no, we're not going to let you pace back to the peloton. They'll issue a barrage, which is just basically a split between the peloton and the team cars, and they'll say, no, you cannot come up. And so essentially then the rider cannot come up with aid through the barrage and catch back up the peloton. They have to do it like physically through their own capabilities. And again, yeah, it's interesting, but it's so gray, right? The
Like a
race is
judgment call.
it,
Yeah.
it's such a judgment call, and so it really depends on the race commissary, and that's one of the nuances of cycling, and it's great, is that there's so much gray area, and that anything can happen. And so I don't think you'll ever have a sport that's really defined, because cycling, as you know, is not played within a box. It's not played within a stadium. And so I think that kind of goes with the terrain. The race commissaries will always have so many variables and so many gray areas to deal with. You can never define a rule for every specific variation that happens. So there'll always be this gray area in the sport.
And then in terms of, let's say I'm a spectator, how can I tell who the race commissaires are? And how can I tell, like, in a situation like this, like there's a crash, they may need to make a call whether or not, you know, they get helped up to the peloton or not? Would that be like announced somehow? Like as a spectator, how do I know who they are and like what decisions they're making?
You don't know. Okay, well, so if you're a spectator at home, so this is the thing. If watching cycling in person isn't super great, because like the riders go so fast by you. You'll see a lot of people just watching it on their phone on the side, which makes a lot of sense, just because there's too much stuff going on. But the race commissary will be in the car that will be colored for the the race itself. So
Gotcha.
you'll have the race commissary, I believe, is usually in a yellow car in the Tour de France. But it's a good question. I don't specifically know what color there is. The best way to kind of figure out is to see who kind of flags the start of the race. So you'll have all these riders riding, and then there will be the race commissary in front of them, and then to start the race, they'll wave the flag, and then the riders will ride past. And that person in that car will be your race commissary. But if you're not around for the start, because I don't blame you, they're like 200-kilometer races. To be fair, though, the most interesting part of races is at the start, and then potentially at the end, but almost always at the start. So you'll be watching this, and then it's through the announcers. So if you were listening to the audio, they'll let you know what's kind of going on, because there's no... I mean, I would argue that cycling has a long way to go in terms of the UI they provide for the races, where they don't have a good heads-up display. They can be doing so much more. Sometimes they offer like power data of riders, if like riders have allowed that to some degree, which is super neat. But even I don't really care about the power data. I'm not like a big power nerd, but I think seeing the hills that would be coming up on the map, like knowing how close those are, knowing when some of these key markers are coming up, these key turns, could be like in a heads-up display, or like having, you know, like little blurbs of how the race commissary is talking. F1 did this recently, where they allowed you to hear, like they didn't anymore because like of their scandal in 2021 or whatever, but they used to let the race commissary there you could hear them talking to the team directors over the radio. So I think that would be super neat. Sometimes in races in the Flemish Classics this year, you heard the team radios of certain cars. I thought it was super neat as well. There's so much more that cycling can be doing to make races interesting for the viewers, but they're just not doing it right now. It's because it's kind of like an old sport. It's kind of like this, it's like trying to go through this change right now. And you have these old 50-year-olds, 60-year-olds who are fighting against the change. Or these old broadcasters. I think the broadcasters is the main issue, like Rise, or they've been locked into these contracts for so long, and no one's kind of like competing against them. So they have no emphasis to change. You won't know, essentially, other than if you hear through the announcer. or Twitter. Twitter's pretty big, to be honest.
Oh,
It's
wow.
one of those. Yeah, for it's not big in most sports, but for some reason, cycling loves its Twitter.
So in theory, the commissaire has like a radio to all of the teams, and that's how they're kind of telling them, yeah, you can help them out or no, you can't, essentially.
Yeah, radio is a huge part of cycling. So radios are in all the riders' ears. You'll
Oh,
see it
well.
on their backs, these like little bulbs. Riders have now started putting on their chest instead, so that it's more aerodynamic. That's why they put it on their chest. Apparently, they've done wind tunnel testing. It's
Wow.
more aerodynamic to have the radio on the chest, and you'll have all the riders on the team. And then if they are speaking to the radio, you'll see them press their chest, and then they'll like be talking like this, blah blah blah, and so that's like them basically saying something to the radio. But it's essential for riders to know what's happening in the race, because it's hard for us as viewers to understand what's happening in the race, let alone being in the race itself. It's even more difficult. And so without this radio communication back and forth, you really don't know what's going on. And if a rider gets really frustrated, it's like a huge no-no. You never do this, but if they get super frustrated, they like take the radio out of their ear,
Oh,
and they're like, "Fuck, I'm done with this," kind of.
wow.
Just to show you how big radio is that in the Olympics they don't allow radios. So
Okay.
it's the one race of the year that they don't allow radios, and there was this big, huge upset in 2022 where the Dutch team was stacked. Like you couldn't have a more stacked team. It was like America in NBA
Yeah.
going to the Olympics, and so they're going. And their leader crosses the line and raises her hand as if she had won the race. Little
Okay.
did she know that a rider had gone in a breakaway, was 2 minutes ahead of her, and had already won the race,
Oh, wow, jokes.
because she just didn't realize that there was a break ahead. It caused like a major uproar, and it kind of goes to show that without that radio, she didn't see this rider go. Maybe the rider went around the corner. People forgot there was multiple breaks that happened. It got confusing. You
Mm.
didn't know who was who where, and they just like assumed they were in first, and they weren't in first. This lady had already won, but no one knew. So you also have in European races the breakaway. Depends on the race. Again, it's really kind of weird. Some races allow this, some races don't. But the people on the motorbikes, because motorbikes are a huge part of the race, they'll kind of cycle up and they'll show the time gap to the peloton, to the breakaway. So the breakaway will know of the time gap
Mm.
because the moto will come every minute or so and say, hey, you're 2 minutes and 30 seconds ahead of the peloton. And so they'll kind of have a gauge of like, I don't know why they need to do this anymore with the radio and with people like the DSs, director sportifs in the car, like listening and watching the races on TV on their phone, but they still do it. So that you'll see the moto comes by and just like holds up a sign, and that's what they're doing.
Mm.
They're holding up the time gap.
And that would be the people on the motorcycle. They're not from a specific team. They're kind of, again, like race organizers who'd be holding this sign up.
Yeah, yeah. So they're hired by the race organizers. Like I think it costs like 650 an hour for the helicopter plus people on the helicopter, and then the motos are like also some money as well. Motos have been kind of criticized because there was too many, and I think in 2019 in one of the Flanders Classics, someone got run over by a
Oh,
motorcycle, like
shit.
one of the cyclists,
Oh, man.
and he died. Yeah,
I didn't
not a
know
great way to die. And also, I think the biggest complaint about the motos is that they aero draft people. So if you have a motorbike in front of you by 50 meters or something, it's like still a huge, it's like 10-watt savings. I'm butchering these numbers, people, so please do not hold me accountable for these numbers. But if even if the motorcycle is like 100 meters in front, it's still like a huge benefit. And then if
that.
it
Huh.
becomes like 5 meters, which it often is, it's dramatic how much of a benefit
Interesting.
it is. So
Yeah.
you'll see riders who in like a group who don't want the moto pacing someone, maybe because they want to make it harder on that person. You'll see them like shooing them off with their
Oh,
hand, kind of
okay.
like a
Yeah,
waving
yeah.
motion, because they like get off because like they know how much benefit the moto is,
Oh, I see.
and it's true. Yeah, like riders are really, it's dramatic, and also the crazy thing is you get moto benefit even if the moto's behind you. I didn't take science in university, but somehow you get benefit from the riders, from the moto being behind you through some like aerodynamic magic. And so you also get people pushing them away that way too. But it's a trade-off, right? Like you want to have good quality camera, and at the same time you want a fair race. So you want to, it's a trade-off. You'll never get rid of them. Well, this is what I dug into a little bit, is that you might get rid of them because of drones, because in drones you don't get a lot of aero benefit. There's not a lot
True.
there.
Yes.
And so you can kind of get the benefit of both worlds. And so we'll see. I don't think the motorbike will ever go away, but maybe we can replace some of the busyness on the roads and the congestion that happens with the motorbikes with some drones here and there. So that would be kind of a major benefit. But drones have been used more this year, but not too much. It's still tricky unless the course is like a circuit-based course, or near the end, it's hard to use drones. I recently watched a mountain bike race, my first mountain bike race. This is a little tangential, but I was like really surprised at the quality that they put into that race filming. It was well done. They had a drone in there through the wood section, and it was
Nice.
like it would just go for one segment. Super well done.
Like down low,
I would
following the riders.
Yeah, like down low falling riders, and then like far enough away. There was one point where it was like twisting back and forth, and I was like, how do you know if you're going straight through these twists that you're not going to hit the rider behind that was also going through the twists? Because
Yeah,
the drone guy can only see in front of him.
yeah.
And if there's switchbacks, like, anyway, I was getting stressed, but it was right. I get stressed too easy, but it was right at the end of the race, so it was intense. But it really kind of added to the action, and I think it could be used more in cycling. But again, you kind of need that circuit based. So the motos will always probably be there. Do the motos do anything else that interesting? No, they generally just like annoy riders and stuff. But you'll have more pundits these days go on motorbikes as well. So you'll have from GCN who does a lot of the filming, not filming, but they stream it for a lot of the worldwide audience. They'll have pundits that now go on motorbikes and kind of like are in the race themselves. And I think they
Yeah.
offer very good analysis because they usually have like a past rider on the motorbike, and then they'll be like saying like, oh, that rider looks like he's tired. And like you just can't see in the middle of the pack from when you're watching the race. But the motorbikes that come up the side can actually look into the pack. They can see how the riders are riding. They can kind of judge better because they're so close. And I think the analysis they've started to offer there is really intriguing, and I think they should do more of it. I don't think they should use Philip Javert. I don't think, sorry Philip, but I don't think he's a very good commentator. But I really like Jens Voigt as a commentator when he's on the motorbike. I think he did a great job. So he's like this German who's just got quite a character. So I would watch racing just to hear his voice, to be honest.
Something else, I want to circle back to the radios for a sec. I think you mentioned the term for this, but so I'm a cyclist. I'm talking on my radio. Who am I actually talking to, and where are they? Like, are they in some command center somewhere, or are they actually like in the car, like on the race, or who are they talking to?
Yeah, so the riders are talking to the rest of the team members. Will be able to hear them, but they're also talking to the director sportifs within the car. So the cars will have usually 2 director sportifs. Teams are composed of 16, 12, some number of director sportifs. I don't know. Don't quote me on that. But there's usually 1 or 2 in the car, and then there's a mechanic in the back seat. So if the rider has a mechanic can get out, switch to really fast, or give a replacement bike. And then the director sportifs are in the car dealing with the riders for strategy. So we'll have like a video going of like the TV screen of like, hey, these are the riders, these are where they are. They'll also use VeloViewer. We can dig into VeloViewer in a little bit, but it's just like kind of revolutionize the way riders and teams map out the route. You can basically like see a 3D version of the route, and then put markers down like, oh, there's a big hill here, or there's a piece of road furniture, like a big roundabout, take the left, and or like we're going to want to sprint here, or we want to try and sprint here. And this can get all shipped to the rider's head unit, so their Garmin or their Wahoo or whatever. But then from the car, the DS can also make changes on the fly. Since there's so many tactics going on, they'll be dealing with like, hey, are we going to allow this guy in the break? Are we going to try and catch up to the break? Should we go now? And so there's always this back and forth between the riders and everyone else. And so, yeah, radios are super essential. So you're talking back to these these team cars, and then these team cars are kind of like following behind. Recently, a little interesting tidbit was that a race car from AG2R, which was a French team riding in the Giro, it hit the rider, it hit the back of a rider, like it basically took a rider down. Like it wasn't like the rider was fine, luckily. Like he just had like a big scrape and whatever and all that jazz. The race car was relegated from the race. So there's two types of relegations. You can get relegated for the day, or you can get relegated for the entire race. So you don't really want to obviously get relegated for the entire race because then you're down a car, which is essential if like you need to bring a car up to put a rider in the break. Thankfully that was like stage 19, so they were relegated for the entire event, but it was only 2 more stages left, so it wasn't like the end of the world. Apparently riding in these cars is crazy because apparently it's just like stopping, like it's like the most intense ride ever to be in the back of one of these cars, just because to be able to move with the pace of the peloton, move when you need to, get past these riders when you need to. It's just like a lot of stress. I don't think I'd want to do it, but apparently it's something like that. They'll also have a team car in the front generally that's maybe not part of the race, but it's scouting out to see how the weather is, to see how the road is, all that jazz, and then they can warn riders on the way back. A thing they do often in time trials is they'll have, the crappier riders are going first, and so like the less strong riders are going first, and so if it's a wet day, or they'll say like, hey, this corner's hard or this corner's wet, and that's they'll radio that back to the team who hasn't gone yet with the better riders, so the better riders will know, hey, watch out for this corner, and so you get a lot of benefit from your riders in front through this radio. So radio just provides so much to this race. I mean, communication is key with humans as well, and so it's also key in cycling, but potentially more so than other sports. I guess they're all on the court usually, so it's usually easier to talk to one another, rather with this super spread out terrain. You still need to talk to one another, and radio is the best way of doing it.
Since you made the comparison to F1 earlier, and in my mind I was imagining like these cars kind of talking to their rider, but it's not, they have multiple riders. It's like several riders that they're trying to coordinate all at the same time while they're also driving on the same track.
You get some social dynamics in there that are interesting at times. So for example, in the Movistar documentary, which was a good one to break into if someone wants to watch it, it's on Netflix. It's pretty good, pretty easy to watch. There was there's so much dysfunction within that team, but there was like a day when Marc Soler, when he was still on the team, he just like got so frustrated. Again, he just like pulls out his like earphone and just like throws it away. But also like there was this also day where Miguel Angel Lopez, one of their riders, he literally stopped riding because he was so upset. And why he was so upset was because he needed to make a break. Like he needed to go after a break, basically chase the break so that he wouldn't lose his time. But he swore that the team told him not to, and the team theoretically didn't, but they also didn't provide the radio, I think, to the TV show at the time because they were concerned. But then they also thought, Miguel Angel Lopez also thought Moss, the other GC contender, was told him not to, when Moss said something that could have been taken either way. Like it could have been like, no, don't go, but also could have been like, go. Like it was this weird line where it was kind of this gray area, and so you had this kind of conflict between the two of them saying like, oh, you didn't want me to win, blah, blah, blah. Oh, the team doesn't want me to win. And he just like literally stops riding his bike. And he's like fourth in GC. Wow. It was like a super bad move. Super bad look for him, to be honest, but also like not the best on the team. But for a rider just to like stop in, it's like someone like just like walking off the soccer pitch basically when they're playing a soccer game, and just saying, no, I'm not gonna ride anymore.
But potentially after like multiple days of having already played soccer, and then being like, okay, no more soccer.
I guess there's definitely endurance involved in. It was actually kind of hilarious. The Geraint Thomas, one of his podcasts, he hosted Bale, who's this Welsh soccer player, and he got him onto the podcast. And you could just tell how little Bale knew about like cycling in general, right? It's just like it is a different sport, and so that's what we're trying to do here, is trying to kind of demystify the world, and kind of explain what's so nuanced and exciting about it.
Man, I got one more question for you. I think you light way to end. I heard the term nature break being used when I was watching as well. Can you go into that?
Yeah, I think it's one of the most No, I'm not going to say that. I was going to say it's my most enjoyable aspect of watching cycling, but no, it is not the most enjoyable aspect of watching cycling. But I do find it enjoyable to like toss a coin whether the announcer will discuss the rider taking a piss from their bike or they won't. Today they didn't. Like you could clearly see some riders are good enough to take nature breaks while they're on the bike. Like they get really good at it. I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm not going to be good enough to do that one day. And especially for the poor women that will never be able to do that. But, there could be some tool. But they basically either get off the bike and then they'll try and all do it at the same time, the peloton. Kind of they'll be like, oh, you're taking an H break.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, they'll go up to each other and be like, hey, I need to take a piss. Or like, like, oh, I need to go to the washroom or all that jazz. And they'll all try and take an H break at the same time. Yeah, one of the races.
That's hilarious. I didn't
know
that.
It's hilarious. One of the races early in the spring I was watching, it was just like one day race. I don't remember the name, but the whole peloton's like, okay, we're gonna take a nature break. So they all get off the nature break, and these three riders just go. They're just like, oh fuck it, I don't need a nature break. And so in the past, that'd be like super frowned upon to do that, but now there's like no respect, as they say, air quotes, in the peloton, and people will just go. There was also this big issue in about a month ago with the women's tour where it was, I believe it was La Vuelta, but I could be wrong about that, where Movistar attacked during a nature break with these 6 riders. It was like, oh, you shouldn't have attacked because you're taking nature break, but Movistar explained super well, like we had already planned to attack there yesterday, like it was just like the right time to attack. And honestly, you shouldn't be taking a nature break with the entire team. Like that's just like kind of like is a bad idea because then you have all the riders out of the race. Overall, though, it's still a very contested issue. And one of the funniest things, though, is Geraint Thomas seems to always get fined for you're not allowed to take a washroom break in front of other people. So you can't take a washroom break in front of like viewers. But unfortunately, as cycling is becoming more popular, it's harder and harder to find spaces where you can take a nature break. And so he's fined like 500 francs, I think, per time for using the washroom too close to riders. I mean, to be fair, you could get off your bike and you'd be much less likely to have, because you're like, instead of like a minute of potentially going to the washroom in front of someone, you're at a spot where no one's going to be.
Yeah.
So it's a little bit on his fault that he's kind of taking nature break at the wrong time, but overall it's still it's interesting in that sense. So yeah, if you see a rider going to the washroom and no one's talking about it, they're probably going to the washroom, if you're wondering. Just because they usually try not to discuss it, but if it's super boring, they'll discuss it. No, I appreciate all the questions, Nick. I think we got a lot out of this episode and I hope other people did as well. I really like the kind of like and forth we have here and just kind of digging through some of the nuances and what people find interesting and what people don't. And if people have comments and questions, please send them in. Or if there's things you like, things you don't like, or rooms for improvement that we can do, we'd also love to hear them. We're just trying to do this through like a learning process and getting better at it. And thanks so much to Nick for coming on and taking the time to ask questions about a sport that I think we all should find exciting and we should all learn about. So appreciate it.
Awesome. Thank you, Brent. Learned a lot as always.
Thanks for listening. This has been Brent from Pro Cycling Bets, and we look forward to you listening to the next one. We'd graciously appreciate you leaving us a review on Apple Podcast or whichever podcast player you're listening from, signing up to our newsletter at procyclingbets.com, or following us on social media, specifically subscribing to Pro Cycling Bets on YouTube. All the links are in the show notes. Ciao.